Bonjour, Paris RB. Welcome to my talk. I am altering the deal. Pray that I do not alter it further. I am absolutely honored to be speaking in front of you all today, and I cannot thank the organizers enough for this wonderful conference. So, my name is Brittany Martin. I am the lead web developer for the Pittsburgh Cultural Trust. Since 1984, the Pittsburgh Cultural Trust has been working hard to revolutionize downtown Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, in the United States to create a flourishing arts community. Day by day, I'm a very proud Rubyist. I work on 4 different Ruby on Rails applications at the Trust. Speaking of Ruby, I am also the host of the 5x5 Ruby on Rails podcast, where we discuss Ruby, Rails, open source, and the programming profession. I absolutely adore being the host of the podcast. I get to talk to a lot of my programming heroes. But my absolute favorite part of hosting the podcast is getting to bring on people who have never been on a podcast before. So I am always looking for guests. So if you have anything interesting to say about Ruby, Rails, or open source, please come see me because I'd love to book you onto the show. Also, if you have any feedback about the podcast, I'm more than happy to hear it. And as it was alluded to, I am the president of the Little Steel Roller Derby League based in Youngstown, Ohio in the United States. Basically, roller derby is a fast-paced, full-contact sport that I absolutely adore, and it's brought so many wonderful friendships to me in my life, and also I've located the love of my life because of it. So, what brings me here today? Well, today I'm here to discuss the deal. And the deal is something that could happen to any one of us, and that is your third-party vendor has decided to make a breaking API change that's going to affect you and your application. So today we're going to discuss the understood agreement that you have with your API vendor, and what to do when a breaking change happens, and how we have some amazing tools in our Ruby community that can help. So, I really want you to sit for a second and just think to yourself, do you have full control of your application? Chances are that you don't. It is said that up about 70% of applications that are thought to be internal and completely handwritten code that is entirely internal, that is not true. So it's standard practice to use third-party dependencies and third-party API vendors in order to make our applications grow. This is great and expected because we need to be able to use those resources in order to expedite our coding process. But the question is, do those vendors always behave? You know, APIs, just like web applications, go through changes, revisions, and of course, versions. And there are best practices defined in order to extend or replace an API. And if you're using a third-party vendor, you would expect them to follow along with those rules. And again, this is all great and expected. You want your APIs to version and change. You want them to increase performance, and you want them to introduce new features. But the question is, do you have a strategy in place on what you're going to do if your third-party API has a radical change? Remember, if that API makes a breaking change and you do not account for it, what ends up happening is that your application breaks. And when your users visit your application and it's broken, who are they going to blame? They're going to blame you. They know nothing about your third-party ecosystem. So, in most cases, whenever I want to avoid a personal catastrophe, you want to learn from others. And of course, there have been some breaking API changes in our community that I want to do a little bit of talk about. So this is very applicable to where I am currently standing today. And as many of us know, on September 14th, 2019, strong customer authentication came into effect in Europe, which radically changed the way people buy and sell online. More than 300 million European consumers will actually need to confirm their identity for the majority of their online purchases. And this is whether or not they need to use a password, perhaps their phone, or even a fingerprint. Now, the thing about this is if you did not take on SCA within your company, overnight, all of your transactions are going to fail. Whether or not you're a retailer or a ride-sharing company, all those transactions would start failing. So Stripe was able to accommodate for this, and they came out with a new API called the Payments Intents API. And of course, it was SCA ready, and it made all these available authentication methods available to you. But the issue with that, it was an absolute radical change to anybody who uses the Stripe API. And if you didn't do all the work that was needed, and I'm sure many of us had to, then of course all of your payments were going to start failing. Another one, and this one definitely bit us at the Trust, was in 2018, Instagram decided to revoke their public API. And so it just seemingly overnight stopped working. A lot of apps that depended on it either got slower or they just started not working at all. And the reason they did that was that they wanted to shut off their public API in order to attract new businesses and, of course, to make more money. So in order to accommodate for this change, they decided to introduce the Graph API. Now, the Graph API was the only way to collect data and targeted hashtags, and it required an Instagram business account, which of course is what Facebook wanted. What's sad about it, though, is that they did not give much warning. They shut off the API very early, and it left a lot of developers scrambling who were dependent on the Instagram API. Now, the last API that I wanted to discuss is a story that is close to my heart. Day by day, I work at the Trust, and I work on a multi-tenant Ruby on Rails application that is connected to a third-party arts management software that has a custom CMS attached to it. It is, of course, a third-party API that I'm very much dependent on. It powers not only the website, but it also powers our phone center and our box office as well. Now, when I got hired at the Trust, which granted was 4.5 years ago, the first thing that my boss told me was, hey, the third-party API is built in SOAP. They're going to be coming out with a REST API, and one of your major goals of being the lead web developer here is to be making that transition. Leaving SOAP, that makes sense. That is the modern times. We all expect us to be moving forward onto REST. And so I understood that. But I was also told at that time that the REST API was not ready, and so to kind of brace myself and be ready to make that change. Well, 3 years later, the third-party API finally came out with that REST client. And, and of course, along with that was the deprecation warning that the SOAP client was going to be going away. And so I had no choice other than to move to REST, which is the ideal situation. Well, to my horror, as I started to making those changes from SOAP to REST, we started to run into performance issues, or the REST API simply did not work. And this led us to be in this horrible rollback hell. So rollback after rollback, I would implement a new feature, I would test it in development, we'd deploy it out to production. It was either broken with some sort of weird edge case, the documentation was terrible, or the performance was so poor that we had to roll it back. So we knew that we were going to be losing SOAP. It is absolutely inevitable. No matter how poor that REST API was, we knew we were going to be losing SOAP. And so we really had to sit down as a team and think about how we needed to re-architect our dependencies so that we were able to accommodate for this. The only luxury that we were able to have is that there were many companies going through the same issue, since this is the main third-party API for the arts industry. All of the different cities were going through this issue as well. So that brings me to the title of the talk. The third-party API has altered the deal, and really, this is not the time to pray. What it's time for is to sit down and really think to yourself about how you can minimize your downtime and the cost of making this change. So, whenever an API is going to make a change, you want to make sure that you have a strategy in place within your department to make sure that those changes are tracked and ticketed, so that way the developers can tackle them early on. For me, I prefer that to be the product manager or the engineering manager, so you have an entire ecosystem of third-party APIs, and it is up to them to make sure that they're being tracked and that versions are being tracked as well. You want to make sure that you're sprint planning for it, and you want to make sure that you're taking down all the notes and that you have a change log of all of those APIs happening and that you're able to ticket it in process. Of course, whenever a third-party API is making a change, you want to make sure that there are as many eyes as possible on top of it to make sure that no ramifications are happening, and this is when I like to involve customer support. So even if you think the API change is small, always make sure to let customer support know so that way they can take any note of things that have changed. Now, I am certainly probably not the first person to say this at the conference, and probably not the last, but you should implement automated testing. But the big deal for me is that when I was learning how to test, I was told it was my job to test internal code only, that my third-party APIs, it's their responsibility to be testing their code. Well, what ended up happening for us is that they didn't have any test coverage. And so they were releasing new versions of the API with no test coverage, and then it was on me to make sure that I could catch those in my tests. So what we had to do is that we had to change our entire test suite to actually test them as well. And I'll talk about some libraries that you can be doing that later in the talk. But just keep in mind that even though your responsibility is to test your own code, your uptime is also your responsibility. And so you might end up having to alter your tests to also test their code as well. So the issue for us is that it was hard for us to automate the testing against those third-party APIs. So for me, it takes at least 5 API calls in order to mimic a situation in our CRM. But the beauty of testing an API as opposed to the front end is that the API doesn't care where the requests are coming from. REST APIs operating over HTTP will send the same JSON responses and error messages to a mobile application, the browser, or even a third-party service like Postman. So even if those are working properly and your test suite is passing, keeping a note with that third-party API, should you be caring about performance? And of course, you should. Anytime you make a change to a third-party API, you want to make sure that you're doing performance testing as well and load testing. And that's going to be the case whether you're making a change or the API is making a change as well. So performance testing is checking to see whether or not the system behaves and performs like it should be. It examines the responsiveness, the stability, and the speed of your application. But the big thing for that is that you need to know your own business goals. For us, we don't get steady traffic across our website all the time. Because I deal with ticketing, usually when we have a big on sale, that's when we get hit by a million requests. So we need to know our own individual business goals to know what our API should be able to perform at. Now with load testing, you want to check that your system can handle itself under heavy load. And what this means is that you have a very heavy load of concurrent users logging in and interacting with your website, and that you're able to appropriately send back the correct responses. I personally love to use a tool like JMeter or Flood.io in order to do those load testing results. So, as a reminder, you should always be doing performance testing, but especially when a new change is going to be released by your third-party API. And really, you should be doing load testing all the time. For us, we like to do it quarterly. And spoiler alert, both of these were absolutely crucial when we were having trouble with our API internally. Now, we are very lucky. We are in a wonderful position where we have a rich and wonderful Ruby community, and so there are so many tools that we have available to us in order to make these changes easier. The 3 tools that I want to touch upon today are Scientist, when you need to make major code changes with experiments, VCR, detecting API changes in your test suite, and then, of course, the Own Ruby's internal benchmarking tool. Back in 2016, GitHub, which is a very large Rails code base, as we know, had trouble making changes with confidence, and they decided to tackle it by using a concept called branch by abstraction. That is an architectural pattern to make large-scale changes, and it works by inserting an abstraction layer around the code that you plan to change. Now, the abstraction simply delegates to the existing code to begin with. Once you have the new code in place, you can simply flip a switch in the abstraction to begin substituting the new code for old. So they introduced a new gem, and that is called the Scientist gem. And basically what this does, it enables you to detect instances where if your code base is very complicated, you're able to detect edge cases. And it creates a lightweight abstraction for you that you're able to use throughout your code base. Here is a diagram of how it works. Essentially what you do is you wrap a block around the new behavior that you want to introduce into your code base, and then it will return what that block returns. And so it is up to scientists to determine whether or not it's going to execute the legacy code or the new refactored code and check whether or not the result is the same. Here's an example here of it actually being used. And you can see here that the experiment here is called widget permissions. And then in the actual abstraction, it determines whether or not it's going to use, whether or not the user is valid, or it's going to try a new version there, and then it's going to run that experiment. The next tool that I like to use, which I feel like is a total throwback to the 90s, it makes me so happy, is the VCR gem. And what the gem does is it records HTTP interactions and enables you to create fast, deterministic, and accurate tests, because what it does is it records the API response into a cassette tape and enables you to run that cassette tape over and over in your test suite. And I love the fact that, it just makes that great callback to the 90s. So how it works is when you run your test suite, it will see that mock out to the third-party API. As long as the request and the response you already have are static, it will record it once and it will save it into a YAML file called a cassette tape. And what's really amazing about VCR is that you can use it offline. So there's times where I've run my test suite offline on a plane, perhaps. But what's nice about VCR is that you only make that API request once. As long as you have a valid cassette tape that matches that request, then you can just continue to use that request. So here's an example of it being used in a test suite. So you run it once, and that synopsis YAML will be generated. You run it again, and because it's a match on the request, it does not make another eternal API call. So the way that I like to test a third-party API change is that I delete all of my cassette tapes and I rerun my test suite. If I find failures and I haven't changed the code base myself, I know it's the third-party API. And this has been absolutely crucial into us finding those changes in our code base. Lastly, as many of us are familiar with, Ruby has its own benchmarking tool, which is so useful when you have to compare two different implementations. And this is a real kicker for us and was very huge whenever we have been making this SOAP to REST API change. So you can see here at the very top, we have a benchmarking block. And what I'm doing here is I'm generating a new session. First, I'm doing it with the SOAP API, and then the second block is going to be the REST API. I'm calling those APIs 100 times each and recording the response that is needed. So you can see here that in the end, the SOAP 100 times on that API call took 3.5 seconds. The REST took 26.4 seconds. That is 8 times slower, which is huge for us because as a multi-tenant e-commerce application, knowing that the REST is going to end up being that much slower for us was a huge, huge issue. And something that we were able to go to our third-party vendor and say, this is unacceptable. This is not a change that we can introduce into our code base where you're not going to be able to scale the way that we're used to. So it's so convenient that we have this benchmarking tool built into Ruby. So even when we are armed with these tools, as a development team, we still go through the 5 stages of grief when we know our dependencies are going to break. First of all is denial. We might think that maybe our third-party vendor will take it back. For us, we're like, maybe they'll just keep, the SOAP API going forever. Not that I want to stay on SOAP, but it worked quite well. And so we thought maybe we don't even have to fix this. Second is anger. Whenever something breaks externally, we take it as a personal attack. If you didn't change the code, but now it's your responsibility to keep your website afloat, you can be very angry at the person who might have introduced that change. Just try to remember that this is the third-party vendor is a developer just like yourself. You might try to bargain with them. For us, we have tried to bargain with the vendor in order to extend the functionality or to even just do more testing themselves and to do performance testing, of course. And then you might experience depression as a developer because you know that this change is coming, you have a lot of work to do, and instead of being able to write new features, now it's on you to just keep everything up to parity, which is depressing. But I want to remind you that you need to own up to the change and you need to get to work. Now, there can be a silver lining. What that means is that there could be some opportunity to reduce tech debt. As we are cutting over our SOAP to REST calls, we have found situations where there was absolutely no reason to be calling out to the API. And so we were able to even just delete code out of the code base and keep things slimmer, which makes it, of course, easier for future developers to develop in your code base. And because of those eliminated several API calls, we've improved the health of our overall code base, which we might have not taken the time to do if we weren't forced to make this change. And lastly, always remember that you might have the option to break up with your third-party API. If the API change is going to be far too drastic and you really haven't had a spot in your development cycle to even consider moving to someone else, now might be the time. So you might have been looking for an excuse, and you might want to take some time to evaluate the market before you make those strong changes. So this kind of ties in with Andy's talk, but just a reminder that negative thoughts can absolutely ruin your passion for development. Be positive about the changes that are going to be happening to you, but always remember to rely on the tools and the tool set that you have available to you. Change is inevitable. Welcome it, especially when the deal has been altered. Thank you.